On any given day, even a day like this, thousands of Berliners will converge upon a site that sits in the shadow of one of the most iconic and intimidating buildings in the city. Tempelhof Airport was closed for good in October 2008. Within a couple of years, the people of Berlin began to transform Tempelhofer Feld into a multi-use site, an enormous park larger than the entire state of Monaco. What we're here today to talk about, however, is how this former Nazi megastructure, called the mother of all airports by the architect Norman Foster, became synonymous with the beginning of the Cold War. The site was a testing ground for some of the first aircraft. It became a permanent airfield in 1923. A new terminal building had been added by 1927, but the Nazis would begin construction on a new terminal building in 1936. Three years previously, however, Tempelhofer Feld would play host to a central moment in the Machtergreifung, or the Nazis' seizure of power. The 1st of May had long been a day associated with left-wing causes, and the fledgling dictatorship, having all but neutralised the threat from the Communist Party, now turned its sights upon the trade union movement. The enormous rally which took place on a blazingly sunny afternoon on May the 1st, 1933, marked the beginning of the end of the trade union movement in Germany. A huge stage was erected, the backdrop designed by the architect and future war criminal Albert Speer. The very next day, trade union offices were raided and their funds seized. Only 9 days later, the German Labour Front would be formed as a puppet organisation, supposedly protecting workers' rights in place of the now shattered trade unions. The architect Ernst Sagebiel, responsible for Tempelhof, waited until the Nazis took power to actually join the party. Previously, he had been the assistant to Erich Mendelssohn, a prominent architect of Jewish descent, who was also part of a modernist aesthetic that was derided as degenerate and cosmopolitan by the Nazi Party. In 1936, an enormous structure designed by Sagebiel opened up in central Berlin on Wilhelmstrasse. The former Air Aviation Ministry was opened up towards the end of the summer 1936. Work on Tempelhof would begin in the same year, and this building would make the colossal Air Aviation Ministry look like a garden shed in comparison. By the time Tempelhof was finished, it was over 1.2 kilometres long. Sagebiel's creation was ultimately a somewhat odd collision between the stripped-back sleekness of modernism and the clumsy monumentalism of fascism. The intention was that the Tempelhof building would ultimately be absorbed and eclipsed by Albert Speer's colossal Germania project, which was to be built towards the end of the 1930s. Supposedly, Adolf Hitler himself insisted that the entrance to the airport face a road leading to Albert Speer's proposed triumphal arch, a structure that would have been so big that the Arc de Triomphe in Paris could have theoretically have fitted inside the opening. During the war, the airport was used primarily by Lufthansa, but several of the enormous hangars were used to assemble Stuka dive bombers until 1944. The last Lufthansa flight to leave the airport left during the battle for Berlin on the 23rd of April, but was shot down before it made it to Madrid. Only 4 days later, the airfield would be taken, with the building, despite a battering from the Soviet Katyusha rockets, still remarkably intact. With the battle in the rest of the city still very much raging on, 2,000 German women from the south of the city would be rounded up and marched to the site. As a sign of things to come, they were told to clear the debris from 3 days of carnage, to prepare the runways to be used as soon as possible. The familiar eagles, now mercifully shorn of their swastikas, could still be found around the perimeter of the building today. But this particular lad actually spent 40 years displayed proudly at the US Military Academy at West Point before he was handed back to the people of West Berlin. 3 years after World War II ended, Tempelhof would play a pivotal role in the early stages of the Cold War. But to understand this, we have to go all the way back to the end of World War II. Germany was subdivided effectively, occupied by 4 major allies: the Brits, the French, the Americans, and the Soviets. But to complicate matters, so was Berlin. Berlin lay geographically in the middle of the Soviet zone of occupation, but was also divided by these 4 nations, which means that a British, a French, and an American zone of West Berlin were effectively surrounded by Soviet-occupied territory. To facilitate easy access for the Allies to the western zones of Berlin, 3 air corridors were agreed upon between the Soviets and the West at the end of the war. Although it's hard to pinpoint the date when the Cold War actually began, I think we can mostly agree that 1947 is when things start to get decidedly frosty between the 2 main antagonists. It's that year where the Soviet Union will carry out brutal crackdowns on opposition in Poland and Romania, effectively setting a template for how they will react to similar uprisings and opposition in what became known as the Eastern Bloc states. It's also in 1947 where the governor of occupied Germany, General Lucius Clay, will begin to advise that the Western Allies distance themselves from the Soviet Union. We also have President Truman announcing to the US Congress what would become known as the Truman Doctrine. This was the US policy of containing and limiting Soviet geopolitical ambitions. In purely practical terms, the Truman Doctrine would result in over half a century of the US government throwing its weight, along with the CIA, behind any number of Nazi-adjacent, baby-eating crackpots who would promise to stand in the way of communism. By 1948 then, things are not looking particularly rosy in Germany itself, and specifically Berlin. In that year, the Allies, the Western Allies, decide to issue a new German mark, effectively combating the wildly fluctuating exchange rates and the thriving black market. The Soviets are decidedly unhappy with this move and respond by issuing a currency of their own and flooding that money into Berlin. There follows something of a tit-for-tat battle between the Soviets and the Western Allies, until in 1948, slowly and gradually, rather than suddenly, the West would begin to find it increasingly difficult to transport goods and cargo over Soviet-occupied Germany. Trucks are held up for hours at a time. Train loads are sometimes sent back over what would become the border between East and West Germany. And eventually the Soviets make the announcement that a very large number of bridges and roads connecting the western zones of occupation with West Berlin are in urgent need of repair. This forces the Western Allies to increasingly rely on delivering the goods that West Berlin so desperately required, almost exclusively by the air. General Lucius Clay would lay out his commitment to West Berlin, saying that, "I believe that the future of democracy requires us to stay here until forced out." On June 24th, 1948, all surface routes in and out of West Berlin were finally sealed off by the Soviets. The tentative efforts that had been going on to supply the city by those previously agreed air corridors would have to be radically improved if a city of 2.2 million people was to be fed. The Berlin blockade had begun. Shortages of basic items in West Berlin began to increase, and on June 26th, Operation Vittel would begin in earnest, when a cargo plane would land at Tempelhof airfield. Initially, however, things did not go smoothly, with the Americans and British authorities somewhat learning by doing. The situation began to improve when Major General Tunner arrived to take over, describing the situation he found on arrival as a real cowboy operation. The sheer heights of the Tempelhof building, combined with a relatively short runway, meant landing here at the best of times was a tricky operation. The first non-fatal accidents due to planes overshooting the runway were occurring as early as mid-August. To stop air traffic control jams, Tunner establishes a rule that only one pass at the runway would be allowed before the pilot had to turn around and fly back to base. Using not only Tempelhof but also the Gatow airfield to the west of the city, as well as a brand new airport called Tegel in the north, the initial target of 4,500 tonnes per day of cargo was quickly exceeded. On Easter Sunday in April of 1949, over 7,800 tonnes of cargo were delivered to West Berlin. Now, admittedly, I've got no idea what 7,800 tonnes of stuff would actually look like, and I don't really understand what these numbers mean, but obviously it's a lot of stuff. It took a huge effort, not only on the part of the pilots involved in the Berlin airlift, but the ground crew, of course, and the people of West Berlin itself, to keep the city supplied during the 11 months of the Berlin airlift. It was inevitably not without sacrifice. The sheer intensity of the operation, with a plane landing at Tempelhof every 2 minutes at one point, in often terrible conditions, meant that in total 101 deaths were recorded during the 322 days of the Berlin airlift, mostly due to plane crashes or mechanical failure. This nearby monument commemorates those who died. The events of the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift would cause irreparable damage for the relationship between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. In 1949, the two Germanys would be declared as separate states and would remain so for the next 40 years. For the Western Allies, and in particular the United States, the success of the Berlin airlift was not simply a practical victory, but an enormous symbolic one. Any residual ill feeling that the people of West Berlin may have had for the Yankee occupiers went right out the window. It was buried under an avalanche of images depicting the miraculous success of the Berlin airlift. As for the airport, it would remain in use throughout the Cold War era, popping up in the background of Billy Wilder's 1961 Berlin farce 1, 2, 3, a movie that quite literally depicted the Coca-Colanization of West Berlin by the United States in the aftermath of the airlift.
And enjoyed all the blessings of democracy.
In 2014, 6 years after it closed, a referendum took place on the future of Tempelhofer Feld. It was the result of a citizens' initiative which challenged the local government plans to build upon the site. The success of that grassroots campaign means that this site will remain as is, at least until the people are inevitably betrayed by the politicians. Until that day, Tempelhof Feld will remain a place for the residents of Berlin to exercise, to socialise, and to commit astonishing acts of canine bravery.